Happy Monday. How's everybody doing?
Doing well. Good morning.
Hey, good
Welcome
morning.
to the week.
And I guess go to Knox. So joining us in the Monday morning data chat, we have Felix Eggert joining us all the way from Cologne. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. Very quick. I'm Felix Eggert. I'm based in Cologne, working for a bigger German e-commerce company called Real Digital, managing the Kaufland.de page. I've worked there for a few years, for 4 years now, and originally started the data engineering and BI team, which is, I guess, what we're going to be talking a bit about today.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of which, so for especially for people on LinkedIn, a couple weeks ago, I did a PSA, sort of sent out the bat signal, looking for the author of this wonderful article, which I'll show here. From data-driven to driving data, the dysfunctions of data engineering, by under the pseudonym Mr. Trustworthy, which is why I had to put out a PSA to look for the person. I have a lot of trustworthy friends, but nobody goes by that name. So, or post on Medium like that. So this article, I think, was awesome for a lot of reasons. It actually struck a nerve with Matt and I.
Yes.
We call ourselves recovering data scientists for a reason. We do data engineering for a reason. And so, you know what, but not to steal your thunder or anything, like what drove you to write this article, Felix?
I actually wrote the article maybe 1.5 years ago already, and had it lying around on my desktop somewhere in a text file. That was just about when I was switching from data engineering, from leading the data engineering team to a more general DevOpsy role. And there were just a few thoughts and a few experiences that I had building up a data engineering BI unit from ground up, having former experience in BI, and some things that I just wanted to put down for mostly for myself. It's like writing is therapeutic. Sorry, German here. It's a kind of therapy, and there's just been a few things that bothered me in the field, like how organizational units and processes just tend to grow and become very painful. And I just wanted to kind of write it all out and give myself a good feeling while writing it.
That's interesting. I mean, walk us through that though. What are some of the big dysfunctions that you saw in data engineering?
I mean, the general tone on the general message, I guess, if I'd had to summarize it, it's you need to control organic growth in all kinds and forms. It's kind of the main reason why dysfunctions appear is because things happen, and they happen often uncontrollably and in a not structured way. and that leads over time to problems appearing, and those problems in different companies, I've faced the exact same kinds of problems that you can group in the same kind of patterns. And that was just very, very annoying to me, because hey, like, we should have solved this already a long time ago in a generic way. It can't be that everywhere you look you have the same kind of issue. And that's kind of just the general message, I guess, is you need to get in the driving seat and figure out what kind of organizations, processes, products you want to build as a data engineering team. Otherwise, it's going to happen automatically, and generally it's going to end you up in some local optimum instead of a global optimum.
Yeah, and I think the data engineering profession has been treated, frankly, almost as a hobbyist profession, especially since the advent of Hadoop. It's like, oh, here's this really cool, I have Hadoop, I have Spark, I can install it on my own hardware or my own VMs on AWS. And I think one of the things you're getting at here is that, like, that hobbyist technology-focused mentality doesn't get real work done. It just burns down a lot of AWS dollars, basically.
Yeah. I've had, like, the first setups that we tried out in my company when I started out was Hadoop, because everybody was doing Hadoop. I didn't have that much experience myself when I started, and it's like, yeah, Hadoop. Like everybody's doing it. Go to conferences, they all talk about Hadoop. So that's got to be it. But it turned out like just to set it up and maintain it and run it, the cost not just of hardware but also of manpower to just keep it running, to understand the entire complexity behind it and turn it into something that you can give a random business analyst and make him like create valuable insights from that was far too much. And there are easier ways to achieve the same goal by now. I mean, a lot of cloud technologies where you can just, I mean, look at Google BigQuery, just slap a bunch of terabytes of data into it. In the background, it still uses some more advanced tools and techniques, but it's much easier than managing your own Hadoop cluster. And I feel like a lot of companies are stuck on that level. They realize, oh, we need data engineers and data engineering, and then they hire very tech-minded people maybe, and those build something that is great for tech-minded people, but doesn't really turn into that much business value at the end. At least that's something I've seen a few times, and it's quite sad actually.
Yeah. I mean, over and over again, we've seen this. So one common pattern is company builds out not a very big Hadoop cluster even, right? But their hardware costs are really low. So they have like, 10 to 100 nodes, pretty small cluster. They can do a few things with it, but they very quickly end up spending like $1 million a year on just the team that runs it, which in theory is fine if it's delivering a lot of value. But then it turns out that it's so hard to like manage permissions and manage schemas. And the performance is really poor compared to like a data warehouse for even relatively small jobs that no one actually uses the data that you're investing all this money in creating.
I mean, what are some things that you think data engineers these days should care about?
It really depends what you're going for. I mean, my personal approach would be to stop thinking about the tech and think about the organizational structures. Because there's this like it has a name, this principle, but you build tools and then the organization builds around that.
Oh, Conway's Law.
Conway's Law. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And I think that's something as a data engineer you should be thinking about. How can you steer this kind of development that happens outside of your small bubble that influences how your data consumers and data producers work in their daily lives? So that's been kind of what I wrote down is like, hey, maybe think about, instead of data engineering as a service team, go for a product team approach where you go for a platform. I call it platform teams. I'm not sure how well accepted that terminology is. But I really like the term platform team, where you think, hey, we as a team in a company, let's treat ourselves as if we were a separate company doing B2B stuff. So we build a platform for other people to interact with, for developers, because they're huge data producers, for data scientists who both produce and consume data, and also for analysts that are only consuming data. And then you try to build a product and a platform around this kind of stuff, where you don't just listen for service requests and requirements, but you actually proactively build a product that those user groups can, in self-service, then use.
Right. The one thing I really liked was this inversion of responsibility. I think this is an ideal worth trying to strive for, where instead of the data engineers, microscopically managing every part of the stack and addressing every use case, like flip the funnel and let the users, use the platform that data engineers have built. Like everyone talks about self-service analytics and stuff, and increasingly self-service data pipelines as well. And I really do think it's something that in the past I think people paid lip service to, but I think going forward you'll start seeing more and more of this, partly because the tools are getting easier to build with, and you don't have to focus so much on low-level plumbing anymore. So, but curious your thoughts.
For us, like one interesting thing that we had was we started using Airflow like everybody, we make the same mistakes everybody does. You start using Airflow. I've never actually heard of anybody who's happy with Airflow, but everybody uses it. It's funny, and we realized this was one of the times where we could really see how building up something like that causes organizational change, because Airflow is Python, right? You mainly write Python if you want to orchestrate something. And this was fine for the data scientists. For the business intelligence people, not so much. So they were like, okay, so we need to start hiring Python developers so they can work with the tools that we provide them. And that was a kind of a, oh, wow, like we are basically, by our tool choice, we are deciding what other people are hiring and how many people they will need. And instead, we went for an approach where we built something very generic that basically just reads SQL files and executes them, and told the BI people, hey, here's a folder, drop your SQL file in there, no Python required.
Interesting.
And that's kind of what goes into this kind of product mentality. Like we built a product where people could customize stuff with Python, but we forget that our customers don't use Python right now. This is kind of a large oversight. So we figured out, okay, what do they know? Oh, they know SQL really well. So we just need something that is sufficiently powerful to express everything in SQL, and they need a place to drop it. And that's it. And that's kind of how our mentality regarding that worked, where we tried to figure out, okay, what's the easiest way for people to do that? And it also is, to get back to where you scrolled, this inversion of responsibility. This is how you can achieve inversion of responsibility. You need to give people something they can actually take responsibility for. You cannot drop a Python file on non-Python developers and tell them, now you're responsible for it. They will still come to you with every question they have, because they can't really own it. But if you build something that is in their capacity to actually own it, you're going to have a much easier time to convince other people to do stuff.
Now I'm really curious, because like I actually just wrote a blog post about Airflow last week, and I'll have a follow-up probably this week or next coming out.
And
God,
I'm so sorry for saying that nobody likes it.
No. But so I mean, to be fair here, I'm curious to get thoughts from people watching us today. But part of what I said is, here's some problems with Airflow, like the architecture is old. Here's some major issues we've had. It may still be the right choice for you because it has all this mind share, different managed products like Google Cloud Composer, for example, which Google recommends the standard way of managing BigQuery, actually, even though in many respects it's way, way more complicated than BigQuery itself. But I'm curious, did you guys end up keeping Airflow for certain parts of your architecture, or did you just try to get out of it completely?
We actually dropped it completely. And the key point for us was that we realized we use so little of Airflow, and just making it run was more complex than actually the few features that we were using from it. It has this, I forgot the name, the Python scheduling library that it uses internally.
Oh, it's not Pendulum, is it? It's something else.
Was it Pendulum?
I'm not remembering either.
I forgot. But anyways, we what we really wanted to have is something that really auto scales and schedules itself. And we wanted it in Kubernetes because we use it for everything else. And the Kubernetes runner for it was horrible back at the time. So we decided we need two things. We need something that executes SQL files and maybe a bit of Python code. And we need it scheduled via Kubernetes, and it needs to support DAGs. And those three things are not too complex, so we build our own thing, which I don't normally recommend doing, but in that case, it worked quite well. It runs in Kubernetes, scales up and down, and runs the few Python scripts that we have and SQL files.
Very cool. Have you looked at DBT? I mean, in some sense, DBT is kind of like this concept where it's meant to like enhance SQL for building out DAGs. Data Build Tool is the full name.
No, I actually haven't.
It's gotten really popular in, like, what would you say, Joe, the last 2 years maybe? So it's kind of I think it's been around for a bit longer, but it's kind of blowing up now. So
yeah, I know in the States everyone's all about DBT these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, you have to Google. I think it's Get DBT or something, or DBT data or something, because otherwise you'll come up with like the directed behavioral
that's
theory or
right.
something. So
Yeah. But I think there is this trend toward what I would call auto orchestration. And that is, with orchestration, what I really care about is managing data dependencies, right? Like, I don't want, at some point, every data engineering team starts out using cron, and then they have a job that runs long and breaks the entire pipeline. And then they're like, okay, first of all, I don't want to break my pipeline. And second, I want to pack my jobs together as closely as possible. And that's where they end up with Airflow. But if you can basically have SQL, we can look at the data dependencies for each SQL query that's building out this pipeline and then automatically execute things. Like, I think that's a concept that's really going to take off in the next couple of years. And it sounds like what you guys built is very similar to that.
sounds like it.
Interesting. I've just Googled it at getdbt.com.
Yeah.
It sounds really interesting. I got to admit, I've been out of that kind of field for 1.5 years. So I actually haven't heard of it before. That's really interesting. I'll take that with me.
Yeah, and it's crazy. I think you hit on something very interesting when you said that too. Like the 1.5 years. If you blink, so many things are changing in data right now. So many things are changing in data engineering. And I think to your point too, these. I was writing about this yesterday, actually, writing about brownfield and greenfield projects. But what it's kind of like, either you're going to architect a new architecture or an old one, but and some of the sticking points with that, when you have something new to build, there's a temptation to maybe go down and do like resume driven development, for example, where it's like I can start fresh, I can do whatever I want, so I'm going to choose the cool new stuff. And so it's finding that balance between what is new while also figuring out something that's going to actually add value at the end of the day. So that's it.
Yeah, we really noticed this with Hadoop, where like everybody was doing Hadoop, and we just figured, okay, let's look at what we have and what it costs if we just buy this and that. And at the end, just slapping data in BigQuery will solve 90% of your problems with 10% of the pain. And that's it was really frustrating to me when one of the Google engineers, I told him what I was planning, and he was like, yeah, have you tried BigQuery? And I was almost insulted. It's like, come on, but it's me. I can build something much better, much more. And no, I can't. I literally can't. And very few companies can. And this is just something you just have to maybe a bit swallow your pride if you're coming from a everything self-hosted, everything self-managed kind of field.
Yeah. And I think there's this allergy to SQL.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, but you're working more in DevOps now. I mean, do you see any similarities or differences between the type of work you're doing in DevOps and the data engineering work that you were formerly doing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a similar kind of problem almost, where there's enough literature and blog posts and I think the concepts of DevOps are well established enough to not explain them again. But it's a similar kind of thing with data engineering, where you have to understand in data engineering who are your data producers and consumers, and how can you work as close with them and to them as possible. And it's the same kind of in DevOps, where you have this classically in the Dev and Ops separation. You have the problem that both the dev teams and the ops teams are working in totally different directions, and that kills velocity across your entire organization. With data engineering, it's similar. If you have a team that just is interested in resume-driven development and builds up Hadoop clusters just for the sake of it, then all your analysts are going to be slow as hell. It's kind of a similar thing. I think with data engineering, what's really impressive is how many different kind of stakeholders you have. With DevOps, it's typically mainly your developers, 90%. With data engineering, it's your developers, your analysts, the PMs that look at some like mini analysts, basically, your data scientists. Like everybody needs data and needs to create value from data. So you have a much more central position in the spider web of an organization. So you have much more strings where you can influence what's going to happen outside of your team, and that I think that's one of the most interesting things about data engineering, the position in the organizational network of communication.
Interesting. Do you have an opinion about this concept of data ops, which is kind of meant to fuse data engineering in some sense with DevOps?
I haven't. I've heard the term quite frequently, but I don't think I've read enough about it and thought enough about it to form like a strong opinion or a differentiated opinion on what I like or dislike about it.
Right. That's fair.
Yeah.
I can talk about what we are trying to do in one of our initiatives right now, and you can tell me if that is going into the data ops direction or not. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Debitium.
Oh, yep.
Debitium, like fantastic tool, change data capture on operational databases. We're using it to stream operational database stuff into Kafka and from then into our warehouse structure. And we really noticed that it's still operated by the data engineering team, which is contrary to the self-service thought. So what we're doing as the entire company and the DevOps part is moving to microservices. We're building a Kubernetes operator where the teams that develop their services, they deploy just a small addition in YAML with their service, which then spins up a Debitium connector for their database in their microservice. And now they're also responsible for maintaining and operating this part of their stack. So we're trying to tie the data producing step into the developer lifecycle.
That's cool.
Instead of having it outside and managed by data engineering team.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if that's already data ops or not, but
it's interesting. I mean, I feel like there's the Data Ops Manifesto, but what's your opinion on this, Joe? But I feel like it's still really being hashed out at this point, in spite of the fact that there are a lot of opinions out there. I think there's an ongoing question about what practices are going to work really well in the data ops space, very concretely.
I mean, if you take the classic approach of DevOps and just apply it to data, I think that gets you most or part of most of the way there. And that's basically things like automation. So I think what you're doing is automating tooling, right, and making it accessible. But then there's also the aspects of DevOps to observability and monitoring, right, making sure that you're able to see what's going on, and then incident response. So if you have an incident, what's the protocol for addressing that incident very quickly? I mean, the whole notion of whether you're talking DevOps, data ops, I mean, it all kinds of comes back to the note, if you read like the DevOps handbook, for example, right? Like, I mean, I have a background in supply chain and manufacturing and stuff. And like, I used to be a big nerd about Lean and Six Sigma. And when you read the DevOps handbook, you're kind of like, this reads suspiciously like a Lean handbook, actually, because it talks about the same nomenclature, like reduced defects, right? Quicker time to value, reduce your cycle time, all these things. And these are principles that literally borrowed from manufacturing and operations. And so when you apply it to data, which I think, it's kind of ops all the way down, to kind of steal a term. But DevOps was, I think, the first manifestation of this in engineering, where people had to take seriously the notion of continuous improvement. And then data definitely is the next one, because data is a huge asset. And to willfully ignore continuous improvement of data, I think, is professionally negligent, I would say, at a minimum. But it also exposes you to, I would say the difference is, though, where an application, for example, when it fails, you kind of know usually, like, quickly, because it doesn't work. Data is an interesting one, where if the data is off, you may not know about that for a long time. So you might be making decisions on bad data, and this might go on for months or potentially years. I mean, I personally seen this happen a number of times. Your dashboards are completely wrong because the underlying data is wrong. And therefore, the only, I guess, retort to that at this point is, well, at least it's like directionally correct. So the trend's right. So that, therefore, so it makes it hard to make decisions. So I think that's where the delineation really is for me. Is that data, it tends to be very sneaky, and it has a lot of breakage points and drift that aren't directly obvious in the way that you would maybe unit test or regression test an application. So
that's a really good point. I mean, in classical software, you would normally you write test driven, or not normally, but if you are in the kind of company and setup where this happens, you at least do a lot of testing with unit tests, other kinds of tests. With data, this is much more complex, and this is actually something that really translates to the DevOps world as well, or to the let's call it platform engineering world as well, because there is if you're working in the DevOps space and platform engineering space, and you orchestrate stuff with Terraform, testing is suddenly much harder than with software. How do you test routing rules in some environment? You have to apply them first, and maybe there are some differences between environments that you have to consider. The load is much more in prod than in staging or dev. This is like, you kind of need a different approach, and what I mean, I'm not saying it's a great solution, but what I like to do is doing kind of a monitoring driven development that works for data pipelines as well. You figure out, okay, what are actually the metrics, and you build the dashboards and the alerts, and then implement the rest of the pipeline basically. But you focus very heavily on monitoring instead of on unit tests, because they can only tell you so much across a pipeline that goes 50 steps.
That's a good point.
Yeah, in some sense in data, like, and people have criticized unit testing for this reason as well. To your point, Felix, like, there's a big difference between a unit test and an integration test. And somehow in data, like, everything is integrated, right? Like there's kind of a notion of unit testing, but not really. You're really thinking about data in the aggregate and how things can go wrong and how entropy can slip into your data in all kinds of interesting ways.
Actually got a listener question here. Mike Nash, what's up, Mike? This is a great article. You were mentioning problems for data engineers. Do you think that there will be more pressure on engineers to both focus on ROI for projects in the future, or does this sit with the BI team?
It really depends on how you structure the organization in that sense. If you go basically according to what I posted at the bottom, and you spin up like data engineering as a product team that has its own customers and its own users, then as a product team, the data engineering team has probably a PM, and it has probably some metrics that tell the team whether the products they're building are good or not good. Those metrics should have some sort of ROI component, but probably a bit more indirectly. So data engineering team might have a metric that explains how long it takes for the BI team to build a report from an idea, like type velocity of a data of a BI team or of a data science team, or the possibilities that they have in some quantifiable way. I think that's kind of the success metric for data engineering teams. Since they are enablers and more responsible for velocity of others, I mean, as a platform team, they are not producing value themselves. They are allowing others to produce value. They're kind of one step removed from like really money in the bank account. So I guess that's kind of what I would go for in that setup. ROI in the sense of really cash in the bank account is probably not a good metric for data engineers. But it is for BI, probably, if they do some financial analytics.
What do you think, Matt?
I guess the question is, as a product team, like, okay, so say you're treating data engineering as an internal product team, what kind of KPIs should we adopt from, say, a startup product team to data engineering internal product team? So would it be things like, I don't know, time to fix data quality issues when they're reported in tickets? Because there is a service aspect to a product, even though, to your point, Felix, like you don't want to be viewed just as a service team.
Yeah,
would it be things like engagement? So, for example, back in the Hadoop days, one of the major problems was that the Hadoop team would go to people, here's this awesome Hadoop cluster, and no one would actually use it. And you could look at the logs and see that no one was actually using these systems. So this raises interesting questions to me, that maybe it's time to sort of adopt those kinds of product metrics that you would, engagement internally, use of the product, data consumption, kind of to your point in the article as well, like how much are people building data pipelines on top of your platform? You're seeing a lot of new data pipelines built. And then would you somehow use ROI as a secondary metric? You could say we contributed to all of this ROI and improvement we're seeing.
Well, I mean, we talk about this, we're with the book we're writing, but I mean, we mention ROI a lot, but I don't think it's in the explicit like money in the bank kind of way. It's more like, if I invested in this team and in this initiative, like what did I get out of it at the end of the day, right? I'm spending X amount on engineering salary, Y amount on technology. These two together, what was the return on investment? The return part, though, is an interesting question, right? Because I think it fully depends upon the business case that you're ideally trying to set out to solve in the first place. I mean, even in the article, you mentioned business value, right? And so but it's this mysterious concept where in one hand, it's tangible from an accounting perspective. Hopefully you can attribute back these efforts to, a positive return on, the effort that you put into this investment, so to speak. But the more you unpack this, so it actually becomes a bit nebulous. If you haven't defined it up front what the requirement is. So
I guess, I mean, it really depends on your company and your setup and what your place in this kind of value chain is. I guess there's two broad category of value that you could provide. One is a bit easier. It's still hard, but a bit easier to quantify, which is velocity of people on your platform. Or you can infer it by just the amount of people on your platform, because if it was shitty, then people wouldn't use it. So you can figure out, you can measure things like daily active users in your warehouse, how many new steps are added to your pipelines and self-service, and you can even get, I mean, we do some sort of internal service process where people can write in a certain Slack channel, and one data engineer is like on triage duty to assist with those kind of service requests. And the goal is to have as few as possible of them, because you want to have most of those things at self-service. So this kind of, there are a few places where you can get indicators and decent indicators for how much you make the value generation process of other teams faster. So this is kind of velocity, like if you look at it from like a DevOps perspective, like team velocity, how fast to get new service online. The second broad category, and that's something that's much, much harder to quantify, I think. And if you have any good ideas, I would love to hear them. But that's the ability to do things that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise at all. So velocity is kind of one thing. Like, like the better you are, the more velocity different teams and other teams get, and the faster you have like time to market from other features. But there are some things that are just binary. If you just do batch processing and, I don't know, one time a day extract data from the operational database, you will not be able to do anything that depends on real-time historization of data. It's just like a binary thing. Like if you build a data platform that just doesn't offer you to do certain things, then any data science or developer team that would like to build something on top of that simply can't. And then the question here is attribution, as you said, like how do you attribute some of the value that your users are doing back to you? How much of what they've been building is has only been possible thanks to you, and only been possible so fast thanks to you. If you have any great ideas on how to attribute that back, I would be happy to hear.
Yeah, I mean, in accounting, classically, there's ABC costing, which is like one way of attributing costs, but that assumes you have the capability of doing that in the first place. Otherwise, it's from a financial standpoint, it might be like kind of just allocate time, and it just becomes like it's kind of a mushy sort of metric. You know what I'm saying? Now you got the wheels turning. I actually made a note to think more about KPIs for data engineering as well. As like, we talk about, because everyone talks about adding business value, and actually in this discussion, the more I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, okay, how do you know you're adding business value? I mean, we know we are, sort of, because the company's making money and nothing's failed, right? Or you haven't like blown up the server room, or you haven't caused a colossal cloud bill yet. But is that adding value, or is that just like success by omission almost? Actually, Edward has a very relevant question. How can we calculate the costs of mistakes that hit every part of the business?
Yeah, that's interesting. And those mistakes can be like active mistakes, like it deployed a SQL query and it really messed up a business metric. But often they're like more passive mistakes where entropy works its way into the data from an application, from an external data source, from testing, and no one sees it for 6 months until they realize that, to your point, Joe, earlier, that the numbers and dashboards are way off.
Well, it comes back to the data ops discussion, though, too, because if the essence of any ops dev or data is to reduce defects and mistakes, what's the cost of those? I think that maybe that's another aspect to look at this through, is if your job literally is to help reduce error, then what was the cost of those errors that you prevented? I don't know.
And if we don't do this, then we're facing down the classic problem of organizational structure in enterprises, which is that IT is just seen as a cost sink. And so for example, when COVID hits, who are they going to lay off first? Well, Joe and I have seen it, like data engineers are like, oh, we don't need all these data engineers. That's a luxury, because they don't recognize that like those data engineers are producing value for the company. And then suddenly they want to hire them all back a month later because the reports are all broken.
Oh, really? Is that something that you noticed in your vicinity?
It's something that definitely went down in the last year.
Oh, wow.
We won't go into too many details, but yeah. So yeah, it's a good situation. But yeah, we saw that at several companies around here.
Which is funny though, because I think like companies, right when COVID hit, March and April of last year,
yeah.
Like everybody across the board is like, I don't know if we're going to be in business in 2 weeks or not, right? I don't know if we're going to have a functioning global economy or not. So they just like cut everything. Didn't matter what it was. Do you have a pulse? Cool, you're fired. Basically, is like kind of how that went in the States. It was brutal.
Wow.
And so I think that sort of event was eye-opening, because guess what happened the following month? Companies were saying, automation and data are important, so we need to hire back all those people that we just let go. Plus, we need to build our teams now and start, investing more into data automation and everything, because working from home and just the speed at which things, basically, you pulled forward about 5 years, 10 years of change in about a month. So, and with that, now companies are like, I guess that maybe that was a bit boneheaded to have done that last month. So let's forget we did that and reinvest and double down on all these big bets here.
Oh, that's a good way to build up a organizational culture of trust.
Yeah. Well, you're seeing this play out in the States right now. Yeah, I mean, you see this in the States right now. Why is it hard for companies to hire people? I don't know. So I think a lot of employers are like, gosh, that whole experience sucked as well. I'm going to find somebody that actually values me. Versus sticking it out with people who are companies that are very transactional, and at the end of the day, at the drop of a hat, don't care. So, it's hard in hindsight though, right? Because I mean, that was a time too when it did seem like the economy was falling like in free fall. Yeah. So,
yeah. And I really can't speak for many of the German companies. It's just being in the field of e-commerce. My experience with COVID was, oh shit, we got 4 times the traffic that we usually do. we got to scale.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So kind of a reverse experience, just based on the sector, on the industry.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That's
crazy times all around.
It was.
But if I can I make one more comment to
Yeah.
also the question of Edward?
Sure.
This has been a running gag, because it's the same if you do DevOps or platform engineering to implement DevOps, which is kind of just a certain flavor of how you can implement DevOps practices in a scaling organization. We also have other teams that provide different kinds of platforms, and we all face the same kind of issue, like how do you measure success and failure? And it is hard because you're so removed. And one of the we had this kind of running gag that just came up as a joke of a reverse success metric, where we basically would shut off things, and then depending on how long it took for somebody to complain about it, that's its reverse success number. So the longer it takes after failure for somebody to notice that there is a failure, the less important it is.
I used to do this all the time. Back when I was an analyst, I would intentionally stop sending reports randomly. And if nobody complained, I guess probably wasn't worth doing. And you know which reports to kill.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works for other things as well. Features in your back office, certain widgets or whatever. If you just let them fail or break down, if it takes a week or two for somebody to even notice, assuming like you have a company where people actually do their work and would notice, right? And it's not just completely unmonitored, but then you can safely say this was not that important.
And then it's
like not really an answer to the question of Edward, but it is an approximation that you can sometimes take.
Well, I mean, it's an inversion of the question, though, in some ways, right? So, I mean, if you assume that there are no mistakes, right? I think that might be a good null hypothesis. Assume there's no mistakes you're making at all. So stop doing those things and then see if there are mistakes. And if you find people screaming, I suppose it's a painful way to go about it. But in absence of anything else, I would say knock yourself out. Maybe have your CD handy in case you need to find another job.
It's almost like data chaos monkey.
Oh, there goes Felix again.
He's out of here.
Marcus, I think that says consistent uptime, ROI, like a ton of classical companies do.
Yeah.
But insurers no will ever dare to improve or update anything too. I could see the rationale behind that.
It's just the metric discussion is just such a thing, because you are not directly contributing to the company value. And even the things that you can measure are not directly related to the things that other people do to improve the value of the company. It's so removed in many cases that it's really hard to go beyond rough approximations.
Yeah.
Stuff like this, consistent uptime equals ROE. Yeah, it is an approximation. It's one that you could try, but in a vacuum, it just leads to stagnation, I would say.
It could, and it's interesting too. The ironic thing is we all work in data, and it's for ideally data-driven companies. And so that's sort of the paradox of it all. Is like we're driving business value with data. That's intentionally, I said that in a buzzwordy way, but at the same time, when you tie it back to the activity of the data team itself, right? Like, how do you know you're doing a good job? I think your title, actually, I don't know if you meant this, but let me bring up the title of the article. And for the audience who's joining late, we're talking with Felix Eggert. He wrote this fantastic article, From Data-Driven to Driving Data, The Dysfunction of Data Engineering. The title was very clickbaity, and it was like catnip for Matt and I. So we immediately were like, "Oh, let's read that one."
The content was even better.
Yeah, it was. It's actually a solid article. But from data-driven to driving data, I think that I don't know if you meant this, but I think maybe this does hit on something we're talking about, where maybe what data engineers aren't. Maybe that isn't a data-driven area, but maybe because you're driving data for data-driven decisions, maybe the outcome of that is kind of more downstream, and that's where the value's derived. I don't know.
I think, and that really ties back to the core point of the article. I think it's, even for people that proclaim that they love data, it's okay to not have everything purely data-driven, but it's more important for the data that you have to be driven in the right way. If you build an organizational structure that allows people to work as fast as they can with data, then it's also okay to accept the shortcomings of such of data that you're missing. It's okay to not be able to track everything perfectly. It's more important that you have the processes and the structures and the organizational units and communication paths around that can buffer this. If you have a good data engineering team that works well and effective with all their stakeholders and makes them happy, like, even if you don't have the perfect metric to show that, your work and your approach at doing that work and your willingness to satisfy your users will give you trust as kind of an organizational currency that you can use in lieu of having the perfect metric to show how much value you add. And that is also okay. At least I think. I don't think we can ever find perfect metrics for those kind of internal platform providery things. There's always some perspectives that you miss when you look at certain KPIs. And I mean, if I had a solution for that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here in the podcast. I would be sitting on my private island somewhere that we've sold it.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a tricky one. But
we got to make do with what we have, and that's okay. So.
Yeah, I mean, these are kind of classical accounting arguments too, in a lot of ways, right? Because I mean, in finance questions where it's, well, so yeah, what's the ROI on this? And at some point, it's kind of like you can either come with attributable costs and value, or you can't. It's that simple. If you can't, then I suppose, and it's a question I used to ask people. Certain things like branding, right? Like, I think that was it Seth Godin or somebody, a more famous marketer, asked, well, what's the ROI of putting on your socks in the morning? I mean, you do it. I mean, have you been able to quantify what that brings to you? I mean, probably not. And the same thing happened, a few weeks ago. I had somebody ask, okay, so like, what's the ROI of writing a book? Is this going to be worth my time? And I was like, I think you're really asking the wrong question. If you're looking at it from the angle of, kind of inputs and outputs from writing a book, like in a linear fashion, I think you're missing the entire point of writing a book, which is, it's more of a labor of love, honestly, and a way to explore your own thinking, and I think the ancillary career effects of writing a book or an article even is like, it's more of the interactions you have with people, and maybe the more improved conversations that you have. Maybe you'll make money from it. Maybe you won't, but I think that's entirely misses the entire point, because there's other types of ROI as well, right? It's not just money, but it's also like, like the discussion we're having. You wrote an article, and I think the return on investment of that is like, you meet two really cool guys in the States. We have a fun conversation, and you come away probably more confused because you're like, geez, now I have a lot more questions to ask myself. So I don't know if it's a positive ROI or a negative ROI, but
I've learned about DBT. At least that's the return that I've gotten.
Perfect. Martin also has a question. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Then is data engineering the new IT? It's a service team supposed to do everything, enabling the rest of the organization whose work is now digital and data-driven, and you get blamed for everything too?
Hopefully not. I mean, that's kind of my point, right? Don't make it a service team. Don't make it a service team. Turn it into a product team. Make it a team that has their products and they build it and they have customers and they try to understand what their customers are doing now and what they're going to be doing tomorrow, and they build for that. And if they get requests and just requirements handed from the outside, then they have a PM that looks at it and says, well, that's a great idea, but no, and hands it back. The key to having this kind of setup is because data engineering can and should build scalable solutions for shared problems, not individual problems, but shared problems that different teams or multiple teams and hopefully even different teams have in the organization. So both a BI team and a data science team and developer team, they might all need some sort of data pre-processing. So data engineering builds something that they can use for data pre-processing. And that kind of approach should hopefully, if you have a PM that is confident enough and good enough in doing the PM stuff, to prevent data engineering team from like slipping through and becoming just a service team. That would at least be my hope. It's the same, and this is really where it ties in with DevOps. It's the same problem. If you don't do anything, if there's nobody steering against it, the guy who can use bash scripting is going to do operations. You need somewhere in your organization people that say, no, that's where we're going, but we don't want to be there. We want to go somewhere else. We want to go to the wonderful land of DevOps. So he's not going to just do that. He's going to do something different.
That's awesome.
It seems like there's a major vision component to this, and that is, yeah, you can have all the KPIs you want, but fundamentally, you want to communicate to company leadership that data engineering is not just a cost sink, that it does produce value. Sometimes it can be a bit hard to see what that value is, but explain, like, this is how we're assisting, communicate effectively. This is how we're assisting business intelligence. This is how we're assisting data science. These are the initiatives that we're enabling, and just constantly get that message out there.
Well, it's like the old saying, right? People don't buy like quarter-inch drill bits. They buy quarter-inch holes. Yep. So, I mean, if you focus on the outcome and derive everything back from that, I suppose it's kind of what's important. Got a couple good comments here, or comments. Edward says, even if you're selling data, the value of data engineering isn't obvious. You're always working without a control group and a sample size of one. I see some merit in that. Mike Nash, maybe the ROI is a cumulative effort towards the business goal and the advancements for the organization. I think that's what you're kind of hitting at, Matt.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's just, something in the past. IT always has this reputation, and I consider, data engineering broadly as being part of IT in the enterprise as being just a cost sink, and CEOs and CFOs don't like all those, all that money they have to pay out for databases and talent and everything else. But I hope, that there's this culture coming out of the tech industry and the startups that like IT should really is the center of the business, an opportunity to really grow and generate value. And so I hope that cultural change is happening at more traditional enterprises too.
Part of that's been from decentralizing IT though, and empowering developers to make their own decisions, right? So, and I think that's kind of the self-serve part, kind of like we were talking about in your article, Felix. I think that's also affected developers and software engineers, whereas before it was IT would say, well, here's the tools you're using. You get to use PowerShell and SSIS and have a nice day. And if you don't like it, that's too bad. Whereas now it's like, well, I don't know, pick what you want. You're the expert. I'm not going to get in your way. So.
Yeah, the one comment, one before was also with the sample size of one.
Yeah.
It kind of goes also in that direction. I've read somewhere, and I can't remember where, in the context of DevOps, that some DevOps team was like, yeah, we build platforms for you, like managed Kubernetes platform for you. If you don't want to use it, here's a credit card, or here's a Google Cloud project open. You can use whatever you want. If you think you can do it better, here is the thing. So they created competition for themselves to break out of that sample size of one. Like they suddenly had competition, and the other teams could decide whether they thought they would be doing a better job than their DevOps and platform guys.
That's really interesting.
I don't know how something like that can work with data and data engineering, because it's just so intertwined with everything. But maybe for organizations that are large enough to warrant that kind of experiment, could be worth.
That's a cool idea. Awesome. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap up. Felix, it's been a pleasure talking to you and getting to know your ideas. I just want to show the article one more time for people who are just joining. And the link is in the LinkedIn comments as well. But check his article out, From Data Driven to Driving Data, the Dysfunctions of Data Engineering. I think you'll like it a lot. And for people who want to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Probably on LinkedIn. My name is Felix Eggert, as written. Wait. Here. Just shoot me a message if you have any questions or any comments. I'm not that much of a social media person. That includes LinkedIn, so I'm not going to read it every day. But eventually, I will get back to you if you're interested.
Awesome. And what's your name on Medium?
Mr. Trustworthy at
Okay.
Mr. Trustworthy.
Cool. And for context, this is why I had to put a PSA out on LinkedIn again to find the author, because I don't know who Mr. Trustworthy is. Could be anybody. Cool. Well, thanks to the audience again for joining the Monday Morning Data Chat. Feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Ternary Data. Smash the like button, and we'll see you all next week. Matt and I are going to be talking about the undercurrents of data engineering. A riveting topic that you'll definitely want to check out. So until then, have a nice day. Auf Wiedersehen, and talk to you all later. All right, see ya.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
See you.